The narrative begins with an oppressive, heavy silence in a rain-slicked alleyway, a silence Harriet has learned to recognize as the first warning of a predator nearby. This eerie quiet is not shattered by a wolf cub's cry, but by the ragged, metallic gasps of a man dying in the shadows. Much like a healing sense flaring to life at the scent of blood, Harriet's own intuitive gift pulls her toward the danger rather than away from it. The hook locks the audience's attention when this small, ghostly girl stands over Nam Q, the most feared Mafia boss in Seoul, refusing to flee even as the headlights of his assassins' cars begin to illuminate the dark alley. The story introduces Harriet Miller, an orphan who has spent years living on the cold fringes of the city, much like a ghost that society has long since forgotten. With her pale, porcelain-like skin and silver blonde hair, she is often viewed as an unsettling omen by those she passes, leading to a life of deep, bone-weary isolation. For years, Harriet has survived by being invisible, wandering between the cracks of the bustling metropolis and offering her strange, intuitive knack for fixing wounds for whatever scraps of kindness she can find. She should have stayed in her makeshift shelter as the storm rolled in, but her survival instincts are suddenly overridden by a visceral awareness of pain that pulls her toward the dark, rain-slicked alleyway. There, she finds Nam Q, known as the Monster of Seoul, dying in a pool of his own blood. Despite being a nobody with everything to lose, Harriet decides in that moment that she is tired of walking past suffering. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The shadows of the alleyway seemed to breathe, thickening with the smell of wet asphalt and iron. Harriet's hands trembled so violently she had to press them against her thighs to stay still. Above her, the rain hammered against rusted fire escapes, the sound masking the heavy, rhythmic thrum of tires on the street just a few yards away. The Monster of Seoul lay at her feet, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle that terrified her more than the men searching for him. He was a mountain of a man, dressed in a suit that cost more than Harriet would see in a lifetime, now ruined by jagged tears and a spreading warmth that the rain couldn't wash away. She knew she should run. Every survival instinct honed by years of being a ghost in the city screamed at her to disappear into the darkness. But when she looked at his face, pale, sharp, and strangely vulnerable in his unconsciousness, she felt that familiar, painful tug in her chest. It was the flare of her gift, a heat in her palms that demanded she stay. Reaching into her tattered satchel, she pulled out her meager supplies, a small bottle of antiseptic she'd bartered for 2 days ago, a needle, and some heavy-duty thread. They were tools for a nobody, but right now they were the only things between Nam Q and the grave. A flashlight beam cut through the rain, sweeping across the mouth of the alley. Harriet froze, pulling her small frame over Nam Q's chest, trying to shield him with her own body. She felt like a bird trying to hide a lion. The men's voices were low and jagged, speaking in a dialect she didn't recognize but understood the intent of perfectly. They were looking for a body. As the light moved on, Harriet worked with a desperate, frantic precision. Her fingers, though small, moved with a grace that felt ancient. She didn't just sew the skin, she felt the ebb of his life force and pushed her own meager warmth into the stitches. Each time she pulled the thread taut, she felt a drain on her own strength, a hollow ache that mirrored the reverence of the life weaver magic. She was weaving him back together, stitch by bloody stitch. "Please don't wake up yet," she whispered, her voice lost to the storm. "But please don't die." The metallic scent of blood grew stronger as she worked on the deepest wound in his side. Her vision blurred from exhaustion, but she refused to stop. She was no longer just an invisible girl. She was a shield. When the assassin's footsteps finally faded into the distance, Harriet collapsed against Nam Q's shoulder, her last bit of strength spent. She had patched the monster, and as the cold rain turned to a drizzle, she realized that by saving him, she had tied her ghost-like existence to a world of fire and blood. The transition from the freezing, rain-lashed alleyway to the suffocating warmth of the penthouse felt like a fever dream that Harriet couldn't quite wake from. She sat curled in a velvet armchair that felt too soft for a girl who had spent years sleeping on cardboard and packed earth. Her silver blonde hair, now washed of the city's grime, but still wild and tangled, spilled over her shoulders like frayed silk. Every muscle in her body ached with a hollow, buzzing fatigue, the price of the life force she had poured into the stranger's jagged wounds. She had meant to stay awake, to watch for the monsters that surely followed a man like him, but her exhaustion had won, pulling her into a shallow, fitful sleep. A sharp, indrawn breath shattered the silence of the room. Namkyu's eyes snapped open, his pupils blown wide and dark with the immediate, predatory instinct of a man who lived and died by the sword. His hand lashed out, grasping for a weapon that wasn't there, before his fingers curled into the silk sheets. He winced, a low groan vibrating in his chest, as the movement pulled at the meticulous stitches Harriet had placed in his side. He remembered the rain. He remembered the cold concrete and the taste of his own blood. And he remembered a pair of winter-gray eyes that had refused to look away when his own world was turning black. He turned his head slowly. His gaze landed on the small, pale figure huddled in the chair. In the soft, amber glow of the bedside lamp, she looked less like a girl and more like a spirit, a ghost that had followed him back from the threshold of death. Her skin was nearly translucent, and even in sleep, her small hands were tucked protectively against her chest, as if she were still shielding something precious. Namkyu watched her for a long time, his breathing gradually evening out. He was the monster of soul, a man whose name was whispered in fear, yet he had been brought back to life by a nobody with trembling hands and a threadbare satchel. He felt a strange, terrifying pull in his chest, a tether he hadn't asked for, connecting his violent, scarred soul to her fragile innocence. Harriet stirred, her eyelashes fluttering against her cheeks before she opened her eyes. She gasped, her small frame jolting in the chair as she met his piercing, obsidian gaze. She expected him to shout, to demand to know who she was, or to cast her back out into the cold. Instead, the man who had forgotten how to be human simply watched her with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice like gravel and velvet. Harriet swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't leave you. The monsters were still looking." Namkyu reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near the edge of her chair, and for the first time in his life, the dragon didn't want to burn the world. He wanted to build a wall around the girl who had saved him. The heavy double doors of the master suite swung open with a muted thud, admitting a group of men whose sharp suits and sharper expressions radiated a lethal authority. At their head stood Minho, Namkyu's right-hand man, a soldier who had seen the boss walk through fire without blinking. He stopped dead in his tracks, his obsidian eyes darting from the healing wounds on Namkyu's torso to the small, shivering girl standing in the corner of the room. Harriet clutched the edges of her tattered gray dress, her platinum hair shimmering like a halo against the dark mahogany walls. To the syndicate, she looked like a broken doll that had accidentally stumbled into a lion's den. "Boss," Minho began, his voice tight with a mixture of relief and confusion. "The perimeter is secure. The traitors have been dealt with. We have a medical team waiting to transport you to the private clinic." Namkyu didn't look at his men. His gaze remained fixed on Harriet, who was trying to make herself as small as possible. The terrifying coldness that usually defined him, the aura of the monster that kept his enemies paralyzed, had shifted into something else. It was still a predator's focus, but it was now entirely protective. "I'm not going anywhere," Namkyu rasped, the command in his voice absolute despite his physical weakness, and neither is she. A ripple of uneasy glances passed between the guards. They looked at Harriet's dirt-smudged face and her trembling hands, unable to fathom why their king was tethering himself to a stray from the streets. "Sir," Minho ventured cautiously, "with all due respect, she is a civilian, a nobody. It isn't safe for her to stay here during a transition of power." Namkyu's eyes flashed with a sudden, dangerous heat. He leaned back against the silt pillows, his voice dropping to a low, guttural growl that made the men in the room straighten their spines. "She is the reason I am breathing. From this moment on, she is not a nobody.
She is the only person in this city who is untouchable." He gestured toward Harriet, his hand steady even if his body was not. "Clear out the North Wing. I want the best tailors, the best food, and the best security. If she mentions a single thing she has ever wanted, if she even looks at something with a hint of desire, you see that it is hers before she can ask for it." The syndicate stood in baffled silence. They were used to demands for ammunition, territory, and loyalty, but never for silk dresses and comfort for a girl who looked like a ghost. Harriet's heart hammered as she realized the invisible life she had led was over. She wasn't just a savior anymore. She had become the cherished, lucky charm of a man who owned the city, and the cage he was building for her was made of gold.
The silk sheets were cool against Harriet's skin, a stark contrast to the rough burlap and damp concrete that had been her bed for as long as she could remember. The north wing of the estate was a labyrinth of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling, neon-soaked skyline of Seoul, but to Harriet, it felt like a crystal jar. Every time she walked down the hallways, the soft thud of her designer slippers was echoed by the rhythmic, heavy boots of the men in black suits who trailed her every move. They were silent, their faces masked by sunglasses and stony indifference, but the bulge of the holsters beneath their jackets was a constant, terrifying reminder of the world she had entered. Everything was too much, too bright, too loud, too heavy. The meals served to her on silver trays were exquisite, yet they tasted like ash in her mouth as she thought of the alleyway and the metallic scent of Namkyu's blood. She felt like a ghost girl haunting a palace that wasn't hers, a stray cat that had been dressed in jewels but still flinched at every sudden movement. When a maid accidentally dropped a porcelain cup, the sharp crack sent Harriet diving beneath the vanity table, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her mind instantly returned to the sound of gunfire. Namkyu had not visited her for 3 days, though his presence was everywhere. It was in the roses that were replaced every morning, the way the guards bowed their heads when she passed, and the heavy security doors that clicked shut behind her. She was a lucky charm, a prize to be kept safe, but the isolation was a different kind of pain than the one she had known on the streets. There, she was invisible because no one cared. Here, she was invisible because she was a secret to be guarded. Standing by the window, she watched the rain smear the city lights into blurry streaks of gold and red. She pressed her palm against the glass, sensing the vibration of the city below. She missed the freedom of her poverty, the ability to disappear into the crowd without a tactical team in tow. But then she looked at the bandages on her own hands, the small nicks and stains from the night she saved him, and she felt that strange magnetic pull toward the center of the house. She was terrified of the blood that paid for this gold, but she was even more terrified of the thought of Namkyu waking up in that vast empty bedroom alone. She was a bird in a cage, but for the first time in her life, she realized the cage was meant to keep the world out, not just her in. The heavy scent of rain and expensive sandalwood filled the air as Namkyu finally appeared in the doorway of the north wing. He was dressed in a simple black silk robe, his chest partially bared to reveal the jagged line of stitches Harriet had placed there, a mark of her own life force woven into his skin. He didn't approach her with the terrifying speed of a mafia boss. Instead, he moved with a slow, deliberate reverence, as if afraid the ghost girl might vanish if he startled her. Harriet stood her ground, her silver blonde hair catching the moonlight as she watched him. The silence between them wasn't the oppressive quiet of the alleyway, but something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive when the world wanted you dead. He sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, gesturing for her to join him. When she did, the distance between them felt charged with an energy she couldn't explain. "They call me a monster, Harriet," he began, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her bones. "I was raised in the shadow of my father's sins, forged in a world where blood is the only currency. I thought I had forgotten how to feel anything but the weight of my own armor." He turned his hand over, showing her a faint silver scar on his palm that predated the recent attack. "I have lived 1,000 lives of violence, and not one of them was my own." Harriet reached out, her small fingers hovering just above the scar before she made contact. The heat from his skin was overwhelming.
I know what it's like to be shaped by things you didn't choose, she whispered, her eyes meeting his obsidian gaze. I was an omen to my people, a ghost before I was even a woman. I learned that if I made myself small enough, the world wouldn't see me to hurt me. She looked at the stitches in his side, her voice trembling with a sudden, raw honesty. But when I saw you in that alley, I didn't see a monster. I saw someone who was alone, just like me. My gift, it didn't just want to heal your body. It wanted to find a place where I belonged. Nam-Kyu reached up, his large hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that defied every rumor of his cruelty. In that moment, the connection snapped into place, the mate bond that the reference story had described as a tether of the soul. He realized that Harriet wasn't just his lucky charm or a stray he had rescued. She was the only person who had ever truly seen him. She was the peace to his chaos, the light to his shadow. You are not a ghost, Harriet Miller, he said, his thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek. You are the only real thing I have ever known. As the city hummed outside their gilded cage, the dragon and the ghost girl realized they were no longer two separate tragedies, but a single, unbreakable story.
The atmosphere within the estate began to shift, a subtle change that felt like spring air bleeding into a meat locker. Harriet no longer stayed confined to the north wing. She moved through the limestone corridors like a soft, persistent light. Her healing sense was no longer a burden she hid, but a tool she used to mend the frayed edges of the men who guarded her. She would sit with the younger soldiers, her small hands hovering over their bruised knuckles and knife scars, using her gift to pull the sting from their wounds. For the first time, the soldiers weren't just assets or casualties, they were seen. Nam-Kyu watched from the shadows, his own heart thawing as he witnessed the girl who had saved him, now saving his kingdom, one soul at a time. The violence that had once been the Syndicate's only language was being replaced by a strange, quiet loyalty born of gratitude rather than fear. But peace in the underworld is a poisoned gift. In the dark, cigar smoke-filled corners of the estate's tactical rooms, a different kind of energy was brewing. A faction of the elder lieutenants, led by a man whose face was a map of old grudges, watched the change with growing vitriol. To them, the ghost girl was a virus, a weakness that was turning the monster of soul into a man they no longer recognized. They missed the Nam-Kyu who would execute a traitor without blinking. They loathed the Nam-Kyu who now spent his evenings reading in a sunlit garden just to be near a girl with silver hair. He's soft, the lieutenant spat, the words curling like venom in the air. A king who values a lucky charm over his own iron fist is a king who deserves to be toppled. She has poisoned him with her mercy. The mutiny didn't start with a roar, but with a series of deliberate silences. Orders were ignored, shipments went missing, and the protective ring around Harriet began to thin as loyalties were bought with promises of a return to the old bloody ways. Harriet felt the shift in her bones, a cold, prickling sensation that told her the monsters weren't just outside the gates anymore. They were inside, and they were hungry. She realized that by healing the man, she had inadvertently painted a target on his back, and her gift, which had brought so much life, was now the very thing the shadows wanted to snuff out. The dragon was no longer the only one in danger. The ghost girl had become the catalyst for a war that would determine if mercy had any place in a world built on death. The tension in the estate had reached a boiling point, the air heavy with the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Nam-Kyu sat in his darkened study, the only light coming from the glowing tip of a cigarette he hadn't touched. Across the room, the monitors displayed the shifting loyalties of his empire, red dots representing dissenting factions that were closing in like wolves. He knew the mutiny was no longer a whisper, it was a countdown. And at the center of the storm was Harriet, a girl whose only crime was refusing to let a monster die in the rain. He watched her through a security feed as she sat in the garden, her silver blonde hair a beacon against the twilight. She was humming a soft, nameless tune, oblivious to the fact that his own men were debating whether to spill her blood to restore his ruthlessness. For the first time in his life, the Alpha of Soul felt the paralyzing weight of true fear. It wasn't fear of death. He had greeted death in a rain-slipped alley weeks ago. It was the fear of what he would have to become to keep her. If he chose to fight, he would have to burn the city to the ground.
He would have to unleash a brutality so total that it would stain the very walls she had spent weeks cleaning with her light. He would have to become the monster everyone believed him to be, and in doing so, he would destroy the peace she had finally found. He would be protecting her body while murdering her innocence. Minho entered the room, his voice a low, urgent rasp. "They're moving, boss. If we don't strike now, we lose the North Wing. Give the order. Let us remind them why they feared you." Namqu's eyes remained fixed on Harriet. He thought of her small hands stitching his skin, the warmth of her gift, and the way she had looked at him as if he were a man worthy of saving. He could send her away, back to the ghost life she had known, tucked into a safe, anonymous corner of the world where his shadows couldn't reach her. He could let her go to save her spirit, even if it meant his own heart would finally stop beating. The dragon within him roared for blood, but the man she had resurrected hesitated. He stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor like a whetstone. He looked at the heavy pistol on his desk, and then at the garden. The choice was a jagged blade. Stay and watch her be corrupted by his war, or send her away and live the rest of his life in the cold silence of a king with no throne. He realized then that love wasn't just about holding on. It was the terrifying willingness to let go of the only light you've ever known, to ensure it never goes out.
The velvet stillness of the estate was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic crack of gunfire echoing through the marble halls. The mutiny had arrived. Harriet stood in the center of the grand library, her heart hammering like a trapped bird against her ribs. But for the first time in her life, she didn't hide. She could hear the heavy boots of the dissenters approaching, their voices jagged with the desire to reclaim a monster by destroying the girl who had given him a soul. Namq was at the front of the wing, his silhouette framed by the flickering lights of a dying power grid, a handgun held with a lethal, weary familiarity. He was prepared to burn everything to the ground to keep them away from her, his body a wall of scarred muscle and cold intent. When the doors burst open, the lead lieutenant stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Namq with a sneer of triumph. "Look at you," the man spat, gesturing to the boss's protective stance. "The great dragon, reduced to a bodyguard for a street ghost. Step aside, and maybe we'll let you lead again, once the infection is removed." Namq's finger tightened on the trigger, the air thick with the scent of ozone and impending death. But before he could fire, a small, pale hand reached out and pressed gently against his arm. Harriet stepped forward, moving out from behind the shadow of the man who had claimed her. She looked impossibly fragile against the backdrop of armed men, her silver hair shimmering like a white flag in a storm. "I am not an infection," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the room. She didn't hold a weapon. She held nothing but the raw, terrifying power of her own presence. As she walked toward the lieutenant, the men instinctively shifted, confused by her lack of fear. Her healing sense flared, and she didn't use it to mend a wound, but to project the sheer, agonizing depth of the life she had fought to save. She saw the scars on the lieutenant's face, the old pains that drove his hatred, and she didn't flinch. "You think strength is the ability to kill," Harriet whispered, standing inches from the man's gun. "But I have seen the end of your world. I have held its heart while it was dying in the rain. If you kill me, you don't get your boss back. You just prove that you are too afraid to live in a world where you aren't the predator." She stood there, a vision of absolute, unbreaking peace in the center of a war zone. The lieutenant's hand trembled. In the face of her refusal to break, his violence suddenly felt small, shabby and desperate. Namq watched her, his own weapon lowering as he realized she wasn't the one who needed protection. She was the one protecting them all from the monsters they had become. Harriet wasn't a victim. She was the conscience of the city. And in her quiet defiance, the mutiny began to wither like a flame starved of oxygen. The aftermath of the mutiny did not leave the estate in ashes, but in a profound, ringing clarity. Namq stood on the balcony of the North Wing, no longer looking out at the city as a conqueror watching his prey, but as a man who had finally found something worth building for. Beside him, Harriet watched the sunrise, the golden light catching the silver of her hair and the peaceful curve of her smile. She was no longer the ghost girl hiding in the shadows of the alleyway. She had become the heart of the syndicate, the quiet force that turned a collection of killers into a family of protectors. Under their shared rule, the organization underwent a transformation that the city could feel in its very marrow. The monster of soul had not disappeared, but his claws were now reserved for those who preyed on the weak, guided by the compass of Harriet's compassion. Nam-Q dismantled the old ways of fear and replaced them with a loyalty that was chosen, not coerced. He had realized that the greatest power wasn't in the lives he took, but in the life Harriet had returned to him. Together, they rebuilt the estate into a sanctuary, a place where those the world had forgotten, the ghosts and nobodies like Harriet once was, could find a home. The men in the black suits still walked the halls, but their eyes were no longer cold behind their sunglasses. They looked at Harriet with a reverence that bordered on the sacred, remembering the night she had stood unarmed against a mutiny, and won with nothing but the truth of her soul. She still used her gift, healing the physical and emotional scars of their world, but it no longer drained her as it once had. Her strength grew as she leaned into Nam-Q, finding that her last strength was never truly her last when she had a partner to carry the weight. As the sun fully climbed over the horizon, painting the city in shades of fire and hope, Nam-Q reached for Harriet's hand. His large, calloused fingers fit perfectly between her small, steady ones, a bridge between two worlds that should never have met. He leaned down, his voice a soft, deep rumble that only she could hear. "You were the only one who didn't run," he whispered. Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the kingdom they had built on a foundation of mercy. "I was just waiting for you to open your eyes," she replied. The dragon had been redeemed, the ghost had been seen, and together they began a reign that would be whispered about for generations, a story of how a little girl's refusal to leave a stranger changed the world forever. Moral of the story: the greatest strength is not found in the power to command or destroy, but in the courage to stay and save one when the rest of the world has turned away. True love and redemption begin the moment we choose to protect the light in others, proving that even the darkest heart can be healed by a soul that refuses to give up.